This Week Internet and privacy lawyer Anna Manley joins us for our feature interview this evening. Security Weekly curmudgeon correspondent Jeff Mann joins us to talk about his travels to IBM's Interconnect conference. And in the security news this week, Wi-Fi troubles for smartphones, hacking TVs via broadcast signals, getting locked out of your garage, Android ransomware, and Wi-Fi plus a camera plus an adult toy equals disaster. All that and more on this edition of Paul Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul Security Weekly. Brought to you by the SANS Institute, the most trusted source for computer security certification training and research. Visit SANS.org to explore their full curriculum and latest training offerings. NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email at contact@netsparker.com. Logarithm's Netmon Freemium delivers real-time network visibility to quickly identify emerging threats in your IT environment. Netmon Freemium is a free commercial-grade network forensics and traffic analytics solution. You can use Netmon Freemium's powerful capabilities to search against all observed network traffic, identify abnormal traffic patterns and application usage, and quickly analyze full packet captures. Take the first step towards real-time network visibility. Visit logarithm.com/freemium to learn more and download it today. Welcome to Paul Security Weekly, episode 508 for April 6th, 2017. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. Pretty much wishing I was still in Orlando, Florida, as far as the weather goes, as I'm here in my winter hat because it's cold. On the lines via Skype, Mr. Jeff Mann joins us. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hey, Paul, how's it going? I wasn't in Orlando, but I spent the weekend in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Is that where? Oh no, you weren't at IBM's Interconnect. That wasn't in Milwaukee, was it?
No. That was Las Vegas. I've been on the road a lot the last couple of weeks, but Vegas was a couple of weeks ago. Last weekend was CypherCon. I got this really the coolest badge ever.
Really? That's saying something.
I spoke at Hack for Kids, which,
nice,
in my opinion, is probably the second coolest badge ever.
Those are pretty cool.
Shout out to all those guys up there.
I like what is the cube? Is that there's some kind of cipher, I'm assuming?
So the cube, there's actually, I put a video in the show notes. They made a video about the making of these cubes. It's kind of like its very own capture the flag game. You plug it in, it recharges, so it has a little port somewhere. Mm-hmm. Take my word for it. And as you unlock the puzzles, you can take control of the LED lights that are inside and outside and make it blink different colors and all sorts of things. And people were having tons of fun with it all weekend. So I promised Larry I'd bring it up to the studio and let Larry play with it.
Nice.
And we'll hang it on the badge wall right behind you there so anybody can have at it.
Wow. Thank you very much. That's awesome, Jeff.
All right.
So speaking of conferences, the 10th anniversary edition of Source Boston is being held this April 24th through the 25th are some training sessions, and the 26th through the 27th will be conference talks featuring awesome speakers from the security community. I will actually be giving one of those talks. Which one am I giving? I think it's my latest IoT talk. I can't believe I'm giving another IoT talk again IoT talk, which will be fun. You'll like it. You'll enjoy it.
Oh boy, IoT.
Events will take place in Boston at the Courtyard Marriott downtown. Security Weekly listeners get a $100 discount. Early bird specials end soon. So if you're going to sign up for training or conferences, do it soon and use the code Security Weekly and visit sourceconference.com to do that. It's a lot of fun. Good excuse to come to Beantown. All righty. Let's get into our interview segment for this evening. It is with Anna Manley. Anna is an internet and privacy lawyer based in Nova Scotia, Canada. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Anna, tell us how, I usually ask how you got your start in information security, but how did you get your start doing law on the internet and privacy?
Well, it's kind of a weird story because, you just kind of fall into these practice areas. I know that sounds odd because you think that I'd have to start out studying it, but initially I was studying criminal law, and then I started getting into studying more the black hat activities and a lot of the online stuff, and it just developed from there.
What were some of the early cases that you studied, or were there cases or situations that made you want to study like internet and privacy laws more closely?
Well, most of them had to do with the difficulty with the courts with grappling with some of these issues. So I dealt mostly initially with the difficulties judges have with actually even learning this stuff, because a lot of them didn't have a grasp on it. So that was the start.
Well, isn't it also fair to say, I'm not a lawyer, but I pretend to be one on TV sometimes. But aren't judges sort of accustomed to, they or their staff going through, decades, if not hundreds of years of case law and precedent-setting decisions that have already been made? And with all this internet law, they're kind of winging it.
Well, it's true. They are kind of winging it, but they need, and most of them, they talk to experts. They try to, get a foundation in it. But in the initial cases where they were really struggling with it, and some of my first interest in the law was with intellectual property. And that's where the courts really started to deal with some of the more complicated issues with technology and law, right? Because you have developments in patents, developments in copyright law. So they started to deal with it there. And the courts now are taking cues from IP law in how they're dealing with a lot of these new cases.
But they're applying IP law to new IP law cases, or they're applying IP law to like TCP/IP law.
Well, it's really more the method of how they deal with it. So
it's really more UDP.
I gotcha.
Than
yeah,
TCP.
That makes sense.
Well, they do it by analogy, right? So in IP law, when you have a new technology coming in, judges don't really know how to deal with it. So they look to a similar technology that they've already figured out how to deal with, and they draw a line between the two of them, any comparison that they can. And obviously they're assisted by the lawyers who are making arguments, and then they make a ruling.
What I always found interesting, Anna, and I've paid attention to some of these cases largely because of the industry that we're in, but also because it is kind of like hacking when you look at the way patent laws are manipulated for or the way the patent trolls are trying to manipulate the law in their favor. It is sort of like hacking. What developments have happened recently that have helped the patent troll situation?
Well, the situation is different in Canada than it is in the U.S., but some of the similar developments have been that, courts, although they've recognized that patent trolls exist, they're really bad, historically bad, at figuring out how to draw the line. Like, this is a patent troll, this isn't a patent troll. They're having a really hard time doing that. They've gotten better, but at the same time, they're lagging behind, and patent trolls still manage to take the day a lot of the time, because you have to remember that these people are well-heeled.
Yeah, I always found that interesting is when technologists come up with, in front of something like that kind of challenge, some of the ways you deal with that are very different, right? Because I think a lot of us are like, well, we would just fight it. Like any kind of troll, like in our world, like, well, we'll just, fight them on a level playing field. But That's kind of not how it works, huh? Because fighting it can be very expensive, right?
That's right. That's right. And actually, it's funny because up here in Canada, we have a very interesting case going on right now. It's actually copyright litigation, where we have the internet service providers are suing the small-time sellers of those preloaded set-top boxes that are loaded with Kodi and Kodi media players or IPTV boxes. So you have a really big player, a telecommunications giant on this side, that's actually joined forces with their rival, another very large telecommunications giant, to stomp out all these little guys. And they're doing it one by one.
So wait, they're suing the consumer or they're suing the maker of the set-top box?
They are suing the distributors of the set-top boxes.
Interesting.
It's very interesting.
But now the distributors of the set-top boxes, are they preloading Kodi software on those boxes?
Some of them are. Some of them are, and they're only going after the ones that are preloading the boxes. Mm-hmm. But they're saying that it's an offense under our Copyright Act, where you're authorizing copyright infringement.
But
that's how they're going after them.
All right, and so now we're like having a mock trial. But so Kodi by itself, though, doesn't contain any code that directly allows you to violate copyright laws, right? The software that you add on to that could, but by itself, all of the plugins that are contained within Kodi allow perfectly legal access to free content, correct?
Well, that's right. But the telecoms are making the argument that just by providing access, by making it easier for the consumer, you're authorizing copyright infringement.
How's that going? Like, how's that going for them so far?
Well, you have to remember you have two big players on this side that have all the fancy lawyers in Montreal and Toronto and wherever else, and they're fighting all these little people who sell these things at flea markets or like farmers markets and things like that. And a lot of them sell them on the internet. They don't make much money, but they make enough that it's worth it for them. Mm-hmm. So they're selling these boxes, and then they get these big scary letters from the two largest telecommunications companies in Canada, and they're all running scared basically.
So nothing like that happens in North America, where big companies try to run roughshod over the little guy.
It's a totally new thing.
Well, what's interesting is we can't not talk about what's happening with U.S. ISPs in terms of how they handle customer data. Now, my first question is: are the laws in Canada different from the laws in U.S. with respects to how they protect or not protect your data as it travels through an ISP? Can the ISPs in Canada sell that data without your permission, as is now the case in the U.S.?
They cannot. So in Canada, we grappled with this issue starting in 2013. What happened is that one of those large telecommunication giants I was talking to you about before, they were selling. They weren't selling, but they were accessing people's data. Like they were collecting it in. They were saving it. They were using it to give targeted ads. Mm-hmm. They called it their relevant ads program. Mm-hmm. And they got busted. A lot of people complained. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada was brought in to investigate. Privacy Commissioner investigated, and they determined that they were in violation of our Privacy Act. Not our Privacy Act, sorry. It's something called PIPEDA. It's the Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act. It's a very long name. But
yet another reason, Paul, why we should be considering relocating to Canada.
Well, I love Canada's awesome. I was never considering relocating there. Jeff, that's your prerogative.
It's very cold. It's cold. We still have snow.
Yeah, just coming from Orlando, Canada was not weather-wise on my list of places to relocate to, just solely based on weather.
I think that I have 2 feet of snow outside right now.
Wow. So now, and I want to ask you, what I've heard some very smart some of the smart commentary I've heard on this case as it's unraveling in the U.S. is that now that the U.S. federal government has said, ISPs can sell your data and share it with whoever they want, doesn't matter, that now the individual U.S. states will pass legislation that will, of course, as it sometimes is in the U.S., varying degrees of definitions of how ISPs can and cannot share your data, that will somehow force the hand of the U.S. government to flip this law back or just make it so cumbersome for ISPs to collect such data without violating state law that they'll stop doing that. Does Canada have the same situation? Can the states enact laws similar to where the U.S. has?
Well, so our provinces can enact their own privacy legislation, but as far as the legislation that applies to these companies, to these telecommunications companies, it's all federal. So we have that luxury, right? I mean, our federal government, the powers are significantly more extensive, so they have the ability to pass legislation that sweeps across the board and that covers everybody.
Right.
And you actually have a functioning federal government.
Arguably, we do. Or
Jeff,
perhaps relatively.
we're trying to stay out of politics.
Are
Jeff.
we staying out of politics?
So
I'm going to have you convinced to move to Canada by the end of the segment.
You can have an igloo right next to mine.
That's right. So Anna, do you have thoughts and opinions on how you think we as consumers should proceed, or how the states could influence the recent ruling in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the problem with expecting the states to come in, and I mean, obviously, I'm a Canadian lawyer, but I have a pretty good idea of how things work down there. And having the states handle things means that you have this, like you said, a patchwork of legislation across the board. You're hoping that the ISPs are going to, because they have to adhere with some of the rules put in place by a more stringent, more privacy-minded state, that they should just adhere. They should just apply that across the board. But that's not necessarily going to be the case. Ultimately, I think that the responsibility is going to rest on consumers, and that consumers are going to have to make sure that they know what's happening to their data. Do I think that that's wise? No, because to be honest with you, consumers don't have the knowledge to protect themselves. They just don't.
Well, just to clarify for our listening and viewing audience, and make sure I'm getting it right for that matter, is it right to infer in most cases federal law is tighter, more stringent than state or provincial law? That the higher up you go in the food chain, you expect to have tighter controls, and not the opposite. Because it almost sounds like with what's going on now in the U.S. that if there's going to be any kind of control at all, it's going to be at the state level.
Well, it's not necessarily more stringent at the state level. I mean, it depends on the wording of the legislation. So right. For example, in Canada, Alberta until recently had some of the most stringent privacy legislation on the books. It was great. And they still have that on the books. It's just now our federal government has caught up to that legislation. So whereas before they weren't so stringent, now they have kind of caught up and realized, well, hey, maybe we should get on board with this. People seem to like it. It seems to be protecting our citizens. So we should also adopt some of these measures. And they've done that.
So I've had customers over the years and I'm not going to have the exhaustive list, but I know state of California had specific data privacy or similar type laws that customers that I had over the years were concerned about. Massachusetts, I think also is another state that had laws where basically if you were a company in the U.S. and doing business in most, if not all, of the 50 states, you had to worry about these couple states, and they generally would meet whatever threshold or whatever level of expectation for one or two states and just apply it across the board. Is that a similar way it's done in Canada? Is that the way you think it should be done?
Well, I think that's probably best practice. I mean, think about the money you have to spend on lawyers, and lawyers are not cheap, right? So think about the money you have to spend on lawyers to make sure that you adhere to every single state's regime, but only when you're practicing when you're practicing business in that state, right? So I mean, you come up against it's a practical limitation. Gotcha. In that sense, and then you have to not only adapt your legal and how you're acting, but also potentially the product that you're offering and the information you're collecting. You have to train different staff on what information they can collect, what information they can't collect. Like the practical limitations are certainly there. So you may see that where one state or perhaps several states brings in a bunch of really stringent laws, that companies will just decide, hey, we don't want to take on the extra cost. We're just going to adhere with the most stringent and go with that. But it may also be that they meet you somewhere in the middle, right?
Or it could be they just don't do business in that state any longer.
That's right. Now, it depends on the size of the market, right? Usually,
Yes.
I mean, California is our largest market. So as far as I know, so if California enacts legislation, it's more likely that that's going to be the legislation that companies who are collecting and retaining information adhere to. But it might be that there's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah,
where
it depends on the product.
We're not going to go any farther.
It depends on the product or service too, right? I mean, due to gun laws, I've seen, companies that make products for the gun industry pull out of a state entirely, right? I've also been involved in the cigar industry, right? And speaking to your point, like California is a big state with a lot of people, so mostly they don't ignore that state, but they do have to adhere to all of the laws. So it's very interesting. I want to talk about some federal law that my friends and I have talked about for a long time in security, and it's become a hot button issue today. And that's when you are traveling internationally and come into this country, and what rights you have for your digital devices and whether or not those can be searched. Oh, she's groaning already. She's like, oh no.
Oh no.
I'm more than happy to hear how it works in Canada.
Yet another reason to move to Canada.
But it's the same line of questioning, right? So if I were traveling outside the U.S. as a U.S. citizen and I were to come back and use that as an example, nobody wants to be the test case is the answer that I get, right? Yes, my phone is encrypted. Do I have to decrypt and unlock my phone to let someone search my phone? Do I have to do the same for my laptop? Are those the same? And what are my rights? And what is your opinion on the U.S. law? And then how does it work in Canada?
So it depends on whether you're a citizen of that country you're trying to get into or not, right? So as a U.S. citizen entering into the U.S., just like a Canadian citizen entering into Canada, you have the rights of that country. You do. So you have certain protections. So you're lucky on that front if you're going back into the U.S. Now, when I go back into the U.S., or if I'm traveling down, I travel to the U.S. a lot. So if I'm traveling down to see you guys, and they ask me to, unlock my phone, if I say no, then I'm simply denied entry.
Right.
So there's a direct enforcement mechanism where they say, give us your password, and you say no, and they say, okay, well, we're going to detain you, and you're in trouble. But then there's an indirect enforcement mechanism where you can be denied entry simply because you refused to comply with an order. So now the issue is that in Canada, if you refuse to comply with an order from a border guard, then you are subject to jail time, just like in the US. So potentially, yes. And it seems like the trend is certainly toward, if you refuse to unlock your phone, then you're going to be detained and you're going to be charged with obstructing a border guard.
Well, I've known people that have been denied entry into Canada for something as benign as, say, was going to videotape a conference.
It was inevitable the conversation was going to go. And it's funny, in talking with my friends about this yesterday and the day before, we inevitably segued into a lot of us, myself personally, I haven't traveled to Canada for business, amazingly enough, yet, I think ever. Not by choice, just by circumstance. But I know Larry, who's joined us now. Welcome, Larry, to the show. Hey, Larry. And several others, in our community that are traveling to Canada to go to a security conference, to perhaps provide security services, speak at a conference, videotape a conference. Based on the language that you use, have either been denied entry or detained for some period of time. Could you, and perhaps elaborate on those laws and regulations when people from outside of Canada are traveling inside to do business?
Well, now the issue is that Jeff's referring to a specific incident, and that incident was more about work, right? This is about, do you have a work visa? Are you coming to Canada to work, to take a Canadian's job? Right. That was the issue there. And if you're traveling here for business, you are permitted to travel across the border as long as you're either with a company and you're pre-cleared, you have a TN visa, or you're coming up just to visit friends. You can also do that. But the issue is that when it becomes this weird gray area where you're coming up and you declare at the time of entry that you are going to be working, but you don't have that visa. You don't have that visa in place, so you haven't filled out the appropriate paperwork. Then they get, for lack of a better word, a little sketched out, and they get worried that you're going to stay in the country and start working and taking the job of a Canadian, as they say. So they deny entry.
Yeah, and it's further. Go ahead, Larry. It's further gray, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a great story about that. I had a friend that was driving across the border many years ago to perform at a friend's Canada Day celebration for free. And when stopped at the border, he had all of his gear in his car, and when stopped at the border was questioned, do you know of any Canadian that could do your job? And his response was, I know of no Canadian dumb enough to do my job.
Oh, okay.
Wrong answer.
Was, well, I would agree that's a really great job that, all the Canadians are smarter than he is to do that job. But he's a circus sideshow performer, as in he nails into his skull and lies on a bed of nails and that type of stuff. So I can get where he was saying, I know no Canadian stupid enough to do my job. And even still, he was denied entry.
Well, because even if the work you're doing is for free, you're still caught, right? You still have to have a visa to do that work. And the problem with your friend is that he kind of poked the beast. Yes. And they have so much discretion that for the pay level and the level of education required to become a border guard, they have a ridiculous amount of discretion.
Yeah. My story there was I was going to teach for SANS, and I was detained at immigration there because I was there for work, and it had been multiple trips for me, and obviously that throws a flag that it had been multiple trips, and I was going to be there for 6 days, and I did not have a work visa. Various folks had informed me that I didn't require one, and they were going to turn me around at the border. But the immigration official and the border crossing guards, bent over backwards to allow me to come into the country. They said I could teach for 5 days as a professionally paid speaker, but I could not teach the 6th day.
Interesting.
Okay.
So I said, great, I have a plan to teach this class in 5 days. Let's do it. Here's the plan, which I did have a plan because we teach other agencies in 5 days instead of 6. I said, great, we can do that. Here you go.
It's good. You saved the day.
My story is opposite. I mean, I worked with a guy one time that we were sending up to the Canadian arm of an American company. I don't know if that makes a difference. And he was turned away because he said, yeah, I'm going to do some pen testing, security testing. And they turned him away. But I've been to Canada. I've been overseas many times. And I've never had any issues getting in. And I have gone not necessarily knowing ahead of time what I should say or not say or what I should have in terms of visas. I just kind of bumble my way through. Yeah, I'm visiting a company for a couple of days. I'm going to advise them or whatever. I'm attending a conference. I think the last time I was up there, I said I was speaking at a conference, the same conference where our friend got turned away. Mm-hmm. And somehow I got in. Maybe I have an honest face.
It must be. Like I said, there's a lot of discretion.
Right.
But I mean, it's certainly it's an issue, and people feel very vulnerable at the border, and that's why whenever people get me on the phone, it's and especially security guys, because you travel so much and you travel across border a lot, and it seems very arbitrary. The discretion they have, the rules are constantly changing because a lot of it is policy based. So it's so fluid, and it's extremely frustrating. It's extremely frustrating for people who travel across the border all the time.
Well, now we know.
You never know when you're going to get dinged.
We know you now, Anna, so we can just name drop. We can be I know Anna. So
I don't know if that's a good idea. I'm a little bit of a political dissenter.
That's when you get the cuffs put on.
Yeah. That's probably the equivalent of going, I want my lawyer, right?
So I had sort of another international related question, sort of going back to our previous topic, but I was just wondering, in terms of the hierarchy from state or province up to federal law and what's more stringent, how does then now sort of the new law that's over in the EU that everybody seems to be panicked about, is it the GDPR? I don't even know what it stands for.
Yeah. It stands for General Data Protection Regulation.
I've been
probably freaking out everybody.
I've been hearing this term a lot lately,
Yeah.
and actually we're welcoming on a new sponsor that is specifically addressing the compliance issue. So I'm very excited to hear more about it.
Well, basically, do you just want kind of a general overview of the thing?
Sure, that'd be fantastic.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
So what it is it's new regulations put in by the EU that replace a directive, and that distinction is important because it means that they don't actually. It's already active. Well, it will be rather when the time comes for it to be active. It doesn't have to be voted in by states, so it's already going to be active automatically. So it's not like EU states can choose to take it on. They're being force fed this. So what it is it's a scheme for ensuring that the movement of data across borders is regulated to ensure that the privacy protections across the EU are the same. That's basically it. It's actually, although it has a lot of very stringent requirements for companies, that the reason for the change and for the regulation coming in is to protect consumers.
So I can see that causing some heartache for some companies, especially ISPs that operate internationally, where the U.S. has just said, "Have at it. You can do what you want with personal information for your subscribers until you hit the European borders." Or what if you have European customers? What do you foresee as being the challenges there?
Well, you're talking about a jurisdictional jumble right there, right? Because you're talking about data moving from the U.S. between the U.S. and the EU. So this only applies to companies who provide services to EU residents. Now,
Okay.
That's interesting.
I've had a few customers like that. But go ahead.
Mm-hmm. So, but in that, we're not sure if they're going to be able to enforce it against U.S. ISPs if they're not actually doing business or have businesses based in the EU. So I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure how they're dealing with that. I'd have to wait and see after it actually comes into force in 2018. I think it's May 2018 when it actually comes in. So we'll have to wait for that. But if you are a company doing business in the EU and you are providing this services or whatever to EU residents, then you're caught by these regulations, which are actually quite stringent, and their definition of what personal information is broader than even here in Canada. It includes, so for example, here in Canada, your personal information is anything that is, could identify you. So race, age, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, political affiliation, anything like that. But it doesn't include your IP address. So, but the new regulation in the EU, it does include your IP address. They have some other really interesting provisions also that we don't have in Canada, which I actually, on reading the documents themselves, I found very interesting. They provide that people can anonymize data, and that the regulations don't apply to that data once it's anonymized, which doesn't even come into effect in Canada. Now, off the books, it does. So here in Canada, you can, as long as the information is sufficiently anonymized, and none of us are sure what that means. It's on a case-by-case basis, and it hasn't really been litigated. But as long as the information has been anonymized, it can't identify you, so it's not personal information anymore, and they can do whatever they want with it. So technically, ISPs in Canada can sell anonymized information.
Provided they keep it anonymous. My conversation with Doug White, we were talking about the IP address issue, and I was like, well, what if I'm keeping my DNS data separate and they're just looking at my IP address? He's like, no, dude, they know where your IP address is going, and they know it belongs to you, and they can totally sell that data, like me personally, Paul Sidorian, tied to an IP address. So I think that's what the European legislation is aiming to protect as well, because from an ISP's perspective, like your IP address at a given time is you. That's right.
That's right. And I mean, that's information that would tend to identify you, as you well know, right? I mean, your IP address, that's you basically, right? So, but in Canada, when we went through this thing with the ISPs getting in trouble because they were using this relevant ads program where they tracked your online activity and used it to target you as far as advertising was concerned. They're not allowed to do that because what they were doing is they were doing this on an opt-out basis. So if you were a subscriber to them, in order to not have your information collected and retained, you had to opt out. Specifically say, no, Bell, I don't want you to collect my information. I don't want you to collect it. I don't want you to target ads at me. Whereas they got in trouble because of that provision. Now it's an opt-in. And I have reservations about that as well, because I don't think that they're doing anything to inform consumers about what that actually means.
Do you get a discount if you opt in? That's a big debate here in the U.S. now.
You know what? I think that's a really interesting idea, but I still think there's the same problems because they don't educate consumers. You should see it. What they have on their website is this page where they say, hey, you can opt into this program. We'll only target the ads you want, and you won't have to see all those ads you don't want to see. They're inconvenient. Click on this. It's for convenience. Like, it's really gross. It's really gross what they're doing. But anyway, in the EU, this new regulation, and this is where I'm getting back to it, this new regulation it requires you to opt in. So if an ISP wants to collect that information, just to collect it, not only retain it and sell it and do whatever they want with it, just to collect it, you have to opt in. You have to explicitly say, yes, it is okay for you to collect this information. And that includes your IP address, like to retain it, to connect it with your name. So I think it's good. And to be honest with you, it has more teeth than the privacy legislation in Canada. So it's not a bad thing. Although I think that the compliance issue, the cost will be significant, right? Because you have to adhere to some pretty stringent requirements.
Do you think it will stop people from doing certain types of business in the EU?
Well, I mean, the EU it's a large market. I mean, you guys aren't the largest market in the world. The EU is a very large market, and I think that although the cost will be higher, I think it will be worth it for companies in the end. Says the lawyer, probably going to get paid.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
It sounds like with the buy-in, at least the consumer has some perception of they're getting something for their information. Like, I can imagine there'll be some sort of incentive, whether it's a discount or they get the customized coupons or only the ads they care about, that type of thing. So it's, if nothing else, it's the illusion that they're getting something in exchange for their personal information.
But I actually have a really big problem with it, though, because insurance companies are doing the same thing with genetic data. And I know that the issues are different, but it's about the erosion of the expectation the erosion of your bubble, basically, like your private bubble. This is me. This is the amount of privacy that I expect. It's the erosion
of the illusion of the bubble.
Yes, fair enough. I'll give you that. But I mean, when you incentivize consumers, and I mean, money talks, right? Even for people who don't have a lot of money, like your average consumer, right, relative to these companies who are offering these discounts, people are going to want those discounts. Are they going to fully, critically assess whether or not the cost of that discount is significantly higher than the actual discount itself? I don't think so. I really don't. And it's not that I don't respect people or I think they're dummies. It's just that consumers are reactive and they click, they click when they probably shouldn't. They sign when they don't read things. So, I mean, for example, when consumers agree to give up their genetic information for a break on their insurance, they don't realize that one-time give means that their insurance company can continue to use that information possibly against them, but also against other people, because they use that information to increase insurance rates for people who perhaps don't provide that information.
I completely agree. I don't think that consumers as a whole, regardless of the country, understand the ramifications of what giving up some of your privacy actually means. Sure, it might mean that I was talking to someone the other day, and she was like, yeah, I got a cell phone, and she's like, it was a cheap phone, a cheap plan, and yeah, I got ads on it, but, I didn't pay a lot of money for it. But what if that costs you more money down the road and your data is being used in some other way and your insurance in somewhere else is going up because they're collecting more information about you?
And that's the risk.
Yep. That's risk management.
Jeff, Larry, more questions for Anna.
Hey, well, full
This is open
disclosure,
season.
Anna and I met maybe a year and a half ago at B-Sides Cape Breton, and then we were together again last spring at Atlantic Security Conference, and I think Anna is going to be back again this year. Can you tell us what you're going to be talking about? What's the latest thing you're into right now?
So, among other things, I mean, I'm going to be talking about the regulatory mechanisms that countries, nation states are taking to criminalize encryption. That is the newest talk. And basically, I'm talking very general and a pretty high level about the legal mechanisms by which countries can make sure that there's either a government-instituted backdoor or that they're provided without judicial oversight with encryption keys that companies are required to retain for that purpose.
Well, I think it's a hot topic, certainly here in the U.S. with what we were talking about happening with some of the laws. I've been looking into VPN services that advertise that they don't share any of their data, that they anonymize all of their data, and these services are becoming more and more popular. But at what point, given your talk, right, does that somewhat become frowned upon now by the government, that we're basically cheating the system, right? By using encryption, we're able to cheat the system and be anonymous on the internet. And how much at risk are we? Like, where in the future do you see that happening, and do you see that panning out in any particular way?
I think there's a significant risk of governments instituting that there's some kind of backdoor, or that they're given these encryption keys, or that the encryption keys are kept by companies for use by the government later on. And I'm saying the government, but I mean this could be anywhere from security agencies to other law enforcement branches. But it could also be the tax man, right? I mean, it could be any branch of government. But I think that it's more likely than not that this will happen, and I'll tell you why. Governments do not like that they cannot access your information. The anonymous citizen is the most dangerous element in a society to a nation state. So for citizens to be able to be completely anonymous and to act as an anonymous entity in an increasingly large world, right? The world that is in the internet for people. That's a threat to states, and it's not just a threat to them because these people will do us harm. I mean, that's the angle that governments are taking, right? We're talking, I often say, because terrorism, et cetera. That's the reason we're doing this. But I mean, it's also about tax evasion. It's also about people accessing content that the government doesn't think that they should. It's about copyright infringement. And that's really one of the big ones. And you'll notice that here in Canada and also down in the US, some of the biggest proponents of these backdoors that would be provided to the government are the large copyright holders and the telecommunications companies, because they want to be able to enforce these rights that they have that are very profitable for them. Well, I sound a little bit like a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, no, you're scaring me now, Anna. You're scaring me because it's bringing forth thoughts of the Aaron Schwartz of the world, Bradley Manning's, the WikiLeaks, and largely their mission for a lot of those cases that we've seen in that light is to give people anonymity, is to have information be free, whether that you think it should be copyrighted or secret or not, and there's varying degrees of that in all of those cases for certain. But all of those cases are happening now and have happened very recently. So I think you're right on point with that, and I'm scared now.
I'm sorry to scare you. That is part of my job,
It's good.
I'm also scared because I actually heard an actual lawyer stop and say because terrorism, like it was because reasons.
Yeah. But that's the motivation. That's the motivation behind a lot of this stuff. People are running scared. They do whatever their government says.
Yeah, what's scary for me is that you it's almost like the government is expecting that I'm going to give up some of my security and privacy so that they can have control, right? And a great example of this is I recently lost my phone. And it's interesting how my friends and family who are not in technology or security were kind of like freaking out. They were like, well, like, what if someone takes your data? I'm like, yeah, pretty much have to be a government agency because the phone was encrypted, the text messages were encrypted with Signal, I remotely wiped it, I remotely locked it. Now, I do plan to follow up with some of my forensics friends in the mobile space to figure out exactly on that version of Android just how sophisticated you have to be to break the encryption or bypass the fingerprint reader or the swipe code. But and I like that level of protection, but the fact that it could be compromised because terrorism, as you put it, is that's the frightening part for me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a real possibility. I really do. And I mean, it's happening even up here, right? I mean, people often have this perception of Canada where we're all kind of laid back and, we don't really get all worked up about these things. But we do. I mean, we've passed some of the most concerning government surveillance legislation in the past few years that I think I've ever seen. It's called Bill C-51 is how we refer to it now, but it essentially provides that government agencies can spy on Canadians without any form of judicial oversight. And
yeah, we've had that problem too. We relate to that problem. It's certainly been there.
We share this issue.
Yes, for sure.
I sort of have a little bit of a different concern or take on this because, the idea of accessing consumer data is not a new idea. Recently in the news, not to get political, there's been some issue with the possibility of wiretapping. Wiretapping's been around for a long time. And basically when cell phones first became popular, it was very common, and I had ISPs as customers, and they would keep they called it metadata, I believe, at the time. But, basically all the details of phone conversations, who called who for how long and when and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And they would escrow all that information. And if there was a warrant, a court order, they would turn that over to law enforcement. So, part of the recent discussions, I've always been kind of scratching my head because the capability has been there for a long time and it's been fairly routine. Mm-hmm. Is it easier now? Is it faster now? Does encryption throw everybody for a loop? Yes. But, when I was still at NSA 20-some years ago, we were trying to promote the idea of key escrow, where we'd have that kind of emergency master key, but the government wouldn't hold it, hold it or them. It would be escrowed by a trusted third party. Now you fast forward 20 years and you've got the Googles and the Facebooks and the Twitters and all the social media that are capturing so much information about us anyway, and all the more now that the law has been changed. It seems like for many years there's been more of an inherent trust for these large providers and companies to protect us, or even like the VPNs. I mean, depending on where the encryption happens, at some point there's a demarcation. And if it's your trusted VPN provider, how do you know if you're trusting them? Because they possibly have access to your data still anyway. And how do you know they're not going to flip it for the right price or for the right political legal pressure being applied to them?
Well, I mean, on that note, I mean, then there's the practical limitation of the difficulty in finding out that this is happening. So the only reason that up here when we had the thing with the relevant ads program, the only reason that actually came to light wasn't that there was this huge investigation and then the privacy commissioner got involved. It was that somebody read the fine print and realized, what is this? And made the complaint. And they were very public about it, and that's the only reason that it was actually investigated. But if you have a private company down in the States and they're allowed to collect that information, or they're allowed to represent themselves as being, like, for example, a VPN as protecting information, but they, like you said, they have to hold it at some point. Then how can you find out? Right? These are private companies, and you'd have to actually either make the complaint to a government agency, and then they'd make the determination of whether or not they wanted to take it forward, or you'd have to sue them.
Good luck with that.
It's sounding like the equivalent all the big debate over gun control law, where needless scrutiny and regulation is going to be applied to law-abiding citizens that sort of voluntarily apply, although they might do it kicking and screaming, where the real bad guys are going to still have access to what they want to have access to, and so on and so forth. I mean, do you see an equivalent here?
Well, if you're asking me if the picture is all doom and gloom, which I think is the crux of your question.
Yeah, pretty much.
To be honest with you, I mean, our perception of privacy has changed so much, even just in the past 5 or 10 years, that really, do people actually know what privacy is anymore? I'm not sure that they do. I think that if you ask them the easy question of, well, if somebody walks into your room and you're in the middle of changing, do you feel like your privacy has been violated? Well, yeah, but do you feel like your privacy has been violated when somebody takes your entire browsing history, sells it to another company, and that company uses it to present ads to you that are relevant? Now that sounds innocuous. Yeah, I suppose so. But I mean, the thing is that, like, I used the word erosion earlier, and that's the way I really feel. I feel that's a very appropriate word. I think that it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts is what's going on.
If no one has any more questions for Anna, I have our infamous, I guess you should say, 5 questions.
Oh God.
No more.
Okay.
All right. Anna, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly? All right. 3 words to describe yourself.
Energetic, crazy, cat lady. That's hyphenated.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Ooh, poison.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
The most patient woman in the world.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
Second.
We have to clarify U.S. rules, not Canadian.
Not Canadian rules, right?
Oh, okay.
Those are different.
All right, first then.
Okay.
First.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, living, or otherwise.
Oh,
Canadian or non-Canadian?
But we won't have heard of the Canadian.
This is Liza Minnelli and Rod Stewart.
Ooh, very nice, very nice.
Interesting.
Wow.
So, Anna, when, the conference that you're speaking at is Atlantic Security Conference. Where is that being held and when?
It's being held in Halifax, and it is the now hold on, they're doing a training day, but it's like the 28th
of April.
Of April.
Excellent. Well, I hope everyone attends your talk that is going to that conference. I know if I were going there, I would attend your talk. So,
Paul, one reason not to go to Canada is their official shot is only an ounce. Just saying.
I see, but they have lots of Tim Hortons.
How big is it in the States?
Tim Hortons in hockey. So
they do have Tim Hortons in hockey.
They do, and there will still be snow on the ground, so you could probably go skiing.
There you go. Well, Anna, thank you very much for appearing on Security Weekly.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.
Bye, Anna.